Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning. We are to everybody here as well as those following us on FB Live. We are very lucky here, alhamdulillah, this morning to be able to welcome Miko to give us a lecture this morning. Thank you very much for everyone for attending this. First, welcome to Malaysia and welcome to Indonesia, Malaya. The issue of Palestine may be straightforward for some of us here who have been following what is happening in the Middle East. But you may be surprised to know that many Malaysians included, especially, and of course around the world, who really do not know what Palestine is all about, the conflict in Palestine is all about. When I was a student studying in the UK, I met an Arab guy and asked him, "Where are you from?" And he told me that he's from Palestine. Then I was looking at him, I was thinking what he's trying to say, because as far as I know, there is no Palestine, there is only Jordan, there is Egypt, there is Israel. I thought he was joking. That shows how ignorant I was. And at that time, I was already a university student from Malaysia, a Muslim country. And then I realized that actually many more are confused. Some, for example, think that the conflict in Palestine is because the Palestinians keep shooting rockets to hurt the Israelis. And the problem is actually because of the action of Palestine. They don't have any idea on the history of the conflict. So it's very important for us to really know the background to the conflict. And therefore, it's very important for us to listen to the talk by somebody who has been part of the conflict from his grandfather. And before I introduce, without further ado, actually, I'm going to ask Norma, who is the founder and funder of the Hashim Sani Center for Palestine Studies, who is organizing the talk. And Norma will also introduce the topic as well. Miko, go ahead.
Thank you, Prof. Nazari. The Hashim Sani Center for Palestine Studies is honored to have Miko Peled with us. Miko Peled is a writer and a human rights activist born and raised in Jerusalem. He's considered by many to be one of the clearest voices calling for justice in Palestine in support of the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment and sanctions, BDS, and the creation of a single democracy with equal rights for all in Palestine. Driven by a personal family tragedy to explore Palestine, its people and their narrative, he has written a book about his journey called General's Son, Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. In the foreword to the book, Pulitzer Prize winner Alice Walker writes, "There are few books on the Palestine-Israel issue that seem as hopeful to me as this one." Ralph Nader wrote, "The story of Miko Peled, his mother and father, reveals how facts, compassion, and a universal sense of justice took hold and inspires this energetic and informed voice for peace." So without further ado, I'd like to invite Miko to speak on the topic, is there peace, hope for peace in Palestine? Is it possible to have peace in Palestine? I hope so.
Thank you very much.
What time is it?
All right. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. And thank you, Norma. It's good to see you again. It was exactly 10 years ago that I was in Malaysia last time. And it's a pleasure to be here again. To start, take a moment to think about the thousands and thousands of victims in Turkey and Syria who suffered this horrendous earthquake. And it's interesting because the region where the earthquake hit has been a region where there's been a lot of strife, a lot of conflict going. Exactly the border between Syria. And it shows us how ridiculous it is, how silly it is to fight one another. Because when the natural disaster comes, it doesn't differentiate. If you're Syrian, if you're Kurdish, if you are Turkish. And so reaching out and working together and living together and peacefully and appreciating each other's differences is much better. Because now I'm sure the conflict and the fighting seem so silly, so ridiculous, so pointless in light of this horrendous disaster. So, I'm sure we all keep the victims of this horrendous tragedy in our hearts. And it's relevant. It brings us back to Palestine. Palestine also, people fighting each other, killing each other. And it is so tragic and so unnecessary. And it stems from a desire to control and a desire to steal and a desire to, overpower somebody else. And again, we look at the catastrophe that the Syrians and the Turkish people are now facing. It seems, even more pointless. And the topic of the lecture today is peace possible in Palestine. This is the question that is asked all the time. It's asked everywhere. Is it possible? Well, everything is possible. Everything is possible. The question is, how do we get to that place where peace will become possible? How do we go from where we are today to that place where peace will be possible? Because I don't think there's any question. There's no question. Israelis and Palestinians can live together in peace. They can. I don't think there's any question about that. But what is keeping that from happening is the fact that in Palestine, 75 years ago, an apartheid regime was established. A very racist, brutal regime was established. And that brutal regime, that brutal apartheid state is the state of Israel. And it has gained a lot of support from countries all over the world. And the story about not knowing there was a Palestine is very prevalent. If you walk around to people in Europe, the United States, and you say Pakistan, you say Palestine, they say, "Oh, Pakistan." And you go, "No, Palestine." You go, "Palestine?" Then if you say Israel, you go, "Oh, Israel, of course, we love Israel, of course, Israel, yes." That's the reality still today, even with Palestine being in the news, but it's always in the news from an Israeli perspective. So what people hear is Israel, and then Palestine is only referred to in the context of violence, in the context of terrorism, in the context of all these terrible things. And you never get the actual picture, the actual accurate picture from the news outlets that are available to most people. In order to learn about Palestine, you have to really be interested and motivated to learn about Palestine. That's what it takes. It's not going to happen by just sitting around. And that's very unfortunate because most people are not going to take the time to study this on their own, to learn about this on their own. And that's why there's this enormous gap in understanding. Another enormous problem, I believe, and that contributes to this gap is that when people talk about the history of Palestine, they go back to 1948, which is when the State of Israel was established. Well, the history of Palestine goes back thousands of years. Even the last few hundred years. When we look at Palestine, we are a country that was thriving economically, culturally, politically. And this country that was not a state because it was under, obviously, the Ottoman Empire, but it was in many ways functioning as a state. At least it was very well established as a culture and as an identity. And people it was all erased. It was all completely erased. And it's interesting because the Europeans did business with Palestine. Palestinian olive oil was imported to Europe. Soap and perfume was imported to Europe, or exported, I'm sorry, to Europe. Cotton, barley, on and on and on and on. There was a great deal of trade between Palestine and Europe. Yet the Europeans one day completely forgot all of it. They forgot that there was Palestine, they forgot there was a history. All that we hear today when we talk about the history before 1948 was the Bible. That's what we hear about. Bible, when there was Jesus, then there was really nothing for 2,000 years. And then the Jews came back and everything began to flourish, and then there became a country, which is completely false. Completely false. The narrative that is described and is accepted, mostly in the West, but even in Muslim countries, even in some Arab countries, is that really there was nothing there for 2,000 years. And then the state of Israel was established. The Jews began to return to Palestine, and then the country began to flourish, and they made the desert bloom. This is the prevailing narrative everywhere. And it's completely false. It's completely false. The reality is that when the Zionists came, the Jews started coming back to Palestine as part of what is known as the Zionist movement, which is a movement that was designed and dedicated to creating the state of Israel. Palestine was a country that was blooming. It was a country that was blooming. There were cities and trade and business and everything you could possibly imagine. Big cities, small cities, farms, towns, I mean, everything. With a rich culture. When the Zionists came, just before, when the state of Israel was being established in 1948, around 1948, there was a massive campaign of cleansing that involved horrific massacres and horrific forced exile. All they had to do, all the new state of Israel had to do was take what was already there. The cities were there. The fruit was on the trees. The produce was already in the fields. Everything was there. And people's money was in the bank. People's cars, homes, hospitals, schools, big cities, everything was there. All they had to do was to take it. And that's exactly what they did. They took it. And then they created this myth that somehow the place was a desert. And only when Israel was established, then it began to flourish. And nobody cares to take a look at what happened, what was there just before 1948. How is it that there's so many cities with Arab names? Nobody takes it. And how come there's so many buildings and homes and so many destroyed villages that have Arab names? And how is it there's so many refugees? Where did the refugees come from? If there was nothing there, how is it there's so many refugees outside of there? Nobody takes the trouble to connect the dots and say, wait a minute, this story makes absolutely no sense. Not only do the people not do that, but recently, the newly elected Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, wrote a book. And in his book, he writes the history, the so-called history. And it is entirely false. It's entirely false. And he's interviewed a lot in the United States. Americans absolutely love him for reasons beyond understanding. And he's never challenged on this. He talks about his book. He talks about the history like he's some great historian. And none of the journalists ever challenge him on the facts. So are they ignorant? Are they stupid? Are they just not interested? I mean, who knows? But it's horrifying to see how he is never challenged, and he's considered with such great regard and respect as a great leader and a great historian. And the facts are there. It's not easy. It's not hard to find the facts. There are many books and documentaries and histories that are available. Anybody who's interested can see and learn what took place, what existed in Palestine just before the state of Israel was established, and what happened since. What happened since? Even now, last February of last year, Amnesty International a well-respected, well-regarded international human rights organization, Amnesty, came out with a detailed report of what took place in Palestine since the State of Israel was established. And the conclusion of the report, without any question, is that the crime of apartheid is being committed and has been committed since the State of Israel was established. So what is the response by Israel, of course, but even in the United States? That Amnesty International has become an anti-Semitic organization. That's the response. And the executive director of Amnesty International in the US gave a talk, an excellent talk, after the report came out. And at least 80 offices of members of Congress had announced that they do not accept the report before it was even published. They were in such a hurry to say that they disagree with it that they actually denounced it before they read it, before it was available. That's how absurd the treatment and the relationship between the media and politicians, especially in the United States, is with Israel. It's absolutely absurd. So how do we go from where we are today, where at this particular moment, not only does peace seem like a far-fetched dream, but things are moving towards disaster at a speed that is beyond understanding, beyond belief. Palestine today stands on the edge of a precipice. Things have never been as severe as they are today. The new Israeli government is made of the most racist extremists, the most violent gangs, really is the only way to describe them. And they sit, not only do they sit in the government, but they hold key positions that have to do with defense, which means dealing with Palestinians. They have to do with finance. They have to do with the very bureaucracies that deal with the daily life of Palestinians. And this group of gangsters, really, racist, violent, hateful political movement, is run by zealots. And the difference between zealots and regular politicians is that regular politicians make promises and nobody takes them seriously. Nobody thinks they're going to keep their promises because politicians lie in order to get elected and so on. Zealots don't lie. And that's why it's very dangerous when zealots are given power. We've seen this throughout the 20th century. Every time extremist zealots were in power, it led to catastrophe. Now, when we look at the history of Palestine over the last 75 years, as the Amnesty report very, very clearly shows, and I encourage everybody, it's available online. It's very easy, and it's a very important to read, I believe, and to share. It has been for Palestinians a living hell throughout all of Palestine. And just to be clear, many people consider only small parts of Palestine as Palestine. So the area that is known as the West Bank and the area that is known as the Gaza Strip. And that's it. Those two areas make up only about 20% of Palestine. So when I say Palestine, I mean the entire country, which stretches in the north to the borders with Syria and Lebanon, in the south to the Gulf of Aqaba, and it's very easy, if you look it up, you'll see, and from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea. The boundaries of Palestine are very clear. And the life for Palestinians, and I'll say this again, throughout the entirety of Palestine, and of course to the refugees who live in refugee camps outside of Palestine, has been a living hell. And that is nothing compared to what is coming up. The suffering of Palestinians, the oppression, the killing, the displacement, that Palestinians have been living through over the last 75 years is nothing compared to what we can expect coming up from this particular government. And the two leaders of this racist movement, between the two of them, they hold the agencies that deal with the day-to-day life of Palestinians everywhere. Whether it's law enforcement, whether it's just, day-to-day life, what's called the civil administration, every particular agency. And what Israel did very, very successfully is they're able to divide Palestinians to a point where every area in which Palestinians live is governed by a different bureaucracy. So you've got so many different levels and so many different structures. And depending on where Palestinians live, and mind you, it's a very small country, depending on where Palestinians live, they're governed by a particular agency with particular rules and laws. So to give you an example, to make it real, okay? They're what is called the Palestinian citizens of Israel. And they are third-class citizens. Then there are Palestinian citizens of Israel who live in the southern part of the country called the Naqab. And these are Palestinian Bedouin. And they live under a different bureaucracy. Then you have the Palestinians that live in Jerusalem. And they live under a different bureaucracy and they have a different ID. Then you've got the Palestinians who live in the West Bank, or what used to be the West Bank. Now it's really just an area with ghettos of Palestinians in which Palestinians live. And you've got the Gaza Strip. And every single one of those is governed differently, live under different rules, different realities, and have different issues that they have to deal with. On top of that, it's practically impossible for Palestinians from these different areas to work together, to travel to see each other. And I haven't even mentioned, of course, the Palestinians who live in refugee camps outside of Palestine with horrendous conditions. Now, Israel likes to portray itself as a democracy of Jewish people with a minority of Arabs who are citizens with full rights. Well, first of all, Israel is not a democracy. It's never been a democracy unless you're an Israeli Jew. If you're an Israeli Jew, you live within that structure of apartheid with privileges. Full privileges, just like any other liberal democracy. But only if you're an Israeli Jew. Now, if you're an Israeli Jew, you can live anywhere you want, too. You can live in the West Bank, you can live in the Naqab, you can live in Jerusalem, you can live anywhere. You can leave the country and come back. You don't lose your rights. You don't lose your status. That is not the case for Palestinians. So the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, over 2 million people, living in an open-air prison. In fact, some people say that a prison is worse because at least in the prison they provide you with food and they provide you with something. The Gaza Strip, the vast majority of the water is not fit for human consumption. Now, I might be telling you things that you already know, but to understand whether or not peace is possible, we have to go through all of these different steps and to realize just how successfully Israel managed to fragment Palestine and the Palestinian people. Now, Israel, according to Israel, by the way, is anybody here Palestinian? And has anybody here been to Palestine who's not Palestinian? No? Okay. Are you Mustafa? Okay. Nice to meet you. So Mustafa is a brother of our good friend, Yusuf Jamal. Yusuf told me I would meet with you. This fragmentation is so severe. Now, Israel likes to say that, like I said, it's a democracy, a Jewish democracy with a minority of Arabs, 20% minority of Arabs. Now, the way they count the population allows them to say this, but it's not true. Israel counts Jewish people who live anywhere in the country. They're allowed to live anywhere they want, and they're all counted. It only counts the Palestinians that live in certain parts of the country and hold what is known as an Israeli ID. Israeli citizenship. And that makes up about 20%. But the truth is that Israel governs the lives of all Palestinians, and that within the boundaries of Palestine, which many people consider called Israel, which is really the state of Israel right now, within those boundaries, Israel governs a majority of Palestinians. The majority of people who live under Israeli rule, under Israeli government, are Palestinians. Israeli Jews are a minority, not by much, but they are a minority. So Israel governs about 6 or 6.5 million Israeli Jews and about 7.5 million Palestinians. And this according to Israeli sources. So you've got over 2 million people in the Gaza Strip. You've got about 2 million people who have this dubious distinction as Israeli citizens. Then you've got about 3.5 million Palestinians living in what used to be the West Bank. Now, I say used to be the West Bank because that area called the West Bank no longer exists. It only exists in maps, in some old maps, but it doesn't exist anymore. All that remains from the West Bank are these prisons, these camps, if you will, almost like in which Palestinians live in these ghettos. And their lives, their travel is completely restricted. And forget traveling from those areas out of what used to be the West Bank into Gaza, into Jerusalem, into any other place within Palestine. It's forbidden. So Israel placed all these enormous difficulties on Palestinians to live, to travel, to have access to water. Now, some of this reality is actually in law, in the Israeli law. So if you look at the Israeli laws, there's no question that it's an apartheid state. And there's no question that it was designed as an apartheid state. And nobody in their wildest imagination thought that it should be a democracy that includes the Palestinians. Even though this is Palestine and the Palestinians are the people indigenous to Palestine. And Israelis are settlers who came from outside to colonize Palestine. There's no continuity between what used to be the Hebrews that lived in Palestine thousands of years ago and Israelis who live there today. Israelis who live there today are all the result of settler colonialism, who came over the last 100 years or so. But they like to portray it as though, well, Jews we've been there for time immemorial. That's not true. Palestinians, however, have a very long and rich history. And there's an excellent book that I strongly recommend called Palestine, a 4,000-Year History by Noor Masalha, the Palestinian historian. And not only does he show, the history of Palestine without the mythology, without the Bible, without the Zionist narrative, just pure history. He also shows that the name by which the different empires that governed Palestine used to describe Palestine was always Palestine, going back almost 4,000 years. The Egyptians and the Greeks and the Assyrians and on and on and on. And whenever they were writing or visiting or traveling throughout Palestine, going back, thousands of years, it was always called either Palestine, but that was the name. So this is another layer that needs to be considered as right now as an obstacle to get to the point of peace in Palestine. Now, the Israelis have done an excellent job, and the Zionist movement, which is a very large movement, has done an excellent job in promoting their own story, and promoting their own narrative, and promoting their own interests. They do it everywhere. They do it in the United States, they do it in Europe, they do it in Arab countries, they do it in Muslim countries, they do it everywhere. And they're very successful. Sometimes it's official, so there's an embassy or a consulate. Sometimes there's no embassy, there's no consulate. Sometimes these countries don't even recognize Israel, but still business is done with Israel. Still Israeli companies do business with that country. And so that story is very successfully spread all over the world. And nobody dares to challenge it. Nobody does, or very few people. Most states are afraid to challenge it. So where's Palestine? Where does it exist? Where does it exist? we either accept what exists today in Palestine as Palestine and accept that it's been under the control of a brutal apartheid regime for 75 years, or we recognize Israel, which many people do. Well, if you recognize Israel, this is it. Because what Israel established is control over all of Palestine under its own conditions, in the way that serves its own interests, with no consideration at all for the needs or the rights of Palestinians, at all. And like I said, some of these things are actually in law, in the Israeli law books, but some of them are just, they're not in law, it's just practice. And probably the most glaring one, the most glaring piece of this reality is the distribution of water. This is a number that most people just don't even believe. All of the water in the country is governed by an Israeli agency called Mikorot. And Mikorot, by the way, goes around the world and sells itself as an expert in irrigation. And so they're all over the world. They're everywhere. How much water, what percentage of all the water would you imagine is allocated to Palestinians? Anybody want to try to guess a percentage? How much water? Now, remember, Palestinians are the majority of the population. Okay, how much water would you guess, knowing all of this, is allocated to Palestinians? Anybody want to guess?
20%.
Huh? 20%. Any other? 10%. Any other guesses?
2%.
Huh?
2%.
Well, you're very close. 3%. 3% of the water. So you will have, now, like I said, it's a small country. Even if you haven't been there, you can look at a map. It's a small country. And by the way, I encourage people to visit, to go to Al-Aqsa and pray, to see Jerusalem. I encourage people to visit, always. So 3% of the water is allocated to the majority of the population. So you will have an Israeli town across the street from a Palestinian town throughout the entire country, in many places. Jerusalem, where I grew up, included. And on the one side, on the Israeli side, there's no limits on water. You can have as much water as you need, as much water as you want, to drink, to bathe, to wash, to go to the pool, to water the lawn, whatever you want. There are no limits on water. Across the street, you can have a Palestinian town with maybe 10 or 12 hours of water per week. And what you see is, now you don't know if it's 12, it might be 15, it might be 20. The Palestinians never know. They never know if they're going to wake up in the morning and there won't be water in the tap. So they have to have special tanks to have water in, to collect the water in when it is available. So when you drive along the country, even within what is called Israel proper, 1948 Palestine, you'll see, Israeli towns, very beautiful, very modern. And then you'll see the Palestinian towns, which are distinctly older and, they look more like, Arab towns. And on the top of the homes and even the apartment buildings, you see these enormous black tanks. You don't see them in anywhere in Israeli towns, anywhere. You only see them in the Palestinian towns. And nobody ever asks why. Because the water distribution is completely different. And this can be across the street. So whoever has designed it, whoever does this, it's very, very, it's hard work, sometimes across the street to make sure the water distribution here flows and the water over here doesn't flow. It takes planning, it's not random. So Palestinians never know if they're going to wake up in the water and they'll have water in the tap. And regardless if they're Palestinian citizens of Israel, if they live in the West Bank, it doesn't matter. Certainly in the Gaza Strip. They never know. And it's not that there's a law that says this. It's just a practice. It's just a reality. Mostly Palestinians, there's no law that says Palestinians can't live in Israeli Jewish towns. Although there is a law that says that some towns, Israeli towns, do have the right to decide who gets to live within them in order to maintain the nature of the population, which is, of course, incredibly racist. But there's no law that says that this is a must. But Palestinians will not be able to live in an Israeli Jewish town. I mean, there are some, but it's rare. It's rare. Why? Well, why not? Because it's a racist state. It's a racist society. So nobody wants what they call an Arab neighbor. Nobody wants an Arab neighbor in their building, in their homes, in their neighborhoods. Nobody can even imagine their kids going to school with Arab kids, with Palestinian kids. The education is segregated. The cities are segregated. The towns, as towns are segregated. Even where there are towns, a few towns that are called mixed, where there is a Palestinian population and an Israeli Jewish population. And you look at the Palestinian neighborhoods, there are no sidewalks, there are no parks, there's no water supply, there are no roads, there's no police won't intervene when there's crime. They don't care. If there's crime among Arabs, they don't care. There's no access to there's no housing built for them. There's no infrastructure. And like I said, across the street, and this is within the same town. You have beautiful neighborhoods being built. You have sidewalks, nice sidewalks. You have light at night. You've got electricity. You've got everything you need for a proper neighborhood. And when they announce, and this is true everywhere, from time to time, the city will encourage new housing or build new housing, and encourage people to sign up and to apply to get a loan and to be able to. If Palestinians come, they're always told, sorry, it's full. A friend of mine did this test. He went to to a new development, to the office to sign up for a new home, and he was told, sorry, it's full. They just opened it. They just opened the office. He went back in the car, and his Jewish friend went in and asked to apply. They said, oh yeah, we've got lots of choices. You can choose any apartment you want. We have so many wonderful. And they asked them, why did you just tell my Palestinian friend that there's nothing available? And they said, well, if we allow Arabs to, they don't say Palestinians, they say Arabs. If we allow Arabs to live here, nobody else would want to buy an apartment. Nobody would want to live here. We can't afford to do that. Openly admitting it. That this racist policy is somehow, they have no choice. But certainly that it exists. So again, how do we go from where we are today to whether or not peace is possible? We have to sit through all of these issues, because peace is not magic. Peace cannot exist in a reality where you've got such racism, where it's so deep, it's so deeply rooted that it's completely obvious that there would be racism. It's completely obvious that people can send their kids to school and go to work, and then on the weekends they go to the beach, while people in Gaza have no access to water, or people in Gaza have no access to proper medical care, where a child in Gaza will die from a curable disease, and just a few kilometers away from Gaza, an Israeli Jewish child will live, because the Jewish Israeli child has access to medical care. I'm not even talking about the bombing, the ongoing just terrorizing of people in Gaza, which goes back decades. A child with an ear infection, those of you that are parents, those of us that are parents here, imagine a child with a tooth infection or an ear infection, and there's no access to antibiotics. I mean, the pain, right? The horrific pain of having something so simple and no access. And not because it's not available. In other words, it's not available in the country. It's not because 5 minutes away they couldn't get it. They can get it. But Israel decides who lives and who dies. And if you're Palestinian, then that's just the way it's going to be. And there's no law that says this, but this is policy. This is the reality in that country. So is peace possible in this reality? Something is going to have to change. Something, structurally is going to have to change. Now, I haven't even talked, and I am going to talk about two of the holiest places in Islam: Jerusalem, Al-Aqsa, and Hebron, the Ibrahimi Mosque. I'll start with Hebron. And my friend Maya is an expert in Hebron if you want to talk to her later on. But the city of Hebron is one of the largest Palestinian cities throughout Palestine. It's the largest in the West Bank. Some 250,000 people live there. Okay, and what they did, and there's a part of Hebron which is the old city, which is an ancient, beautiful old city. So they divided Hebron into what they called H1 and H2. H2 is the smaller old city, where you have about 20,000 Palestinians. Now, these most extremist, violent, racist among Israelis, or they're not only Israelis, a lot of them are Americans actually, wanted to take over the old city of Hebron because of its historical and religious significance to Jewish people as well. But their desire is not to create a reality where everybody can live together and everybody can worship together. No, they want absolute monopoly. They want to deny the Palestinians the right, certainly to worship and live, but also to exist. And so you have less than 1,000, maybe 800 Jewish settlers. And like I said, many of them are Americans. Some are Israeli, but some are Americans. Many of them are Americans who have taken over the old city of Hebron. And you've got countless checkpoints and barriers and all kinds of restrictions on the movement of Palestinians, while the Israeli settlers pretty much can move freely within that space of the old city of Hebron. And that is where the Ibrahimi Mosque exists. Now, forget the history for a second. For a Palestinian to go into the Ibrahimi Mosque, they have to go through several checkpoints. And then to enter the mosque, now these checkpoints are of course governed by Israeli soldiers. Why do Palestinians need to go through a security checkpoint and show ID when they go inside their own city, and as Muslims have a right to go to the mosque and pray? Why? Because that's what Israel decided. Now, to get into the mosque, again, they built this terminal, and you have to go through this checkpoint that is operated by Israeli soldiers. Why? Because that's just how it is. They rule the place. Now, what they did was they divided the mosque, an area for the Jews, and an area for the Muslims. And the Jewish settlers, whenever they want, pretty much, they can go into the other part as well, into the mosque itself, and do what they will with it. Or the soldiers go in and do a tour. They can go in whenever they want. When they give the mosque notice, then at least they can roll up the carpets and so on, because they walk in with their shoes. They don't care. And this is, I believe, the fourth holiest, place in Islam. And nobody knows about this, or very few people know about this reality, this horrible reality that exists within Hebron and within the Ibrahimi Mosque. And it's not static. It's a constant push to deny Palestinian rights and push Palestinians out of the old city of Hebron completely, so that these settlers take over. So they rip off the names of streets that have been, the streets of the city, who knows how long, and they put new names, and they put new signs, and they just completely recreating the city based on their own, mythology, based on their own narrative, and disregarding the fact that the vast majority of people living there are Palestinians, even within the old city. It's so horrifying that it's almost impossible to describe in words what Palestinians in Hebron have to go through. And really, the old city of Hebron, like if you wanted to go into a laboratory and create the perfect specimen of apartheid, that's what the old city of Hebron is. It's the perfect picture of apartheid, where very few Israeli Jews, or like some of them are not Israeli, but Israeli Jews have all the rights to come and go and travel and do whatever they want. And Palestinians are not only restricted, but they are pushed out and pushed out and pushed out, and more and more and more and more neighborhoods within the old city are taken over by settlers. And if Palestinians refuse to move, if Palestinians, don't, just want to exist, they are terrorized in ways that, again, is beyond belief. The terrorizing that goes on within that perfect specimen of apartheid. So it's not just the restrictions in movement. It's not just the restrictions in rights, but it's constant terrorizing by a small group of zealots who are hateful and have their own agenda, they have their own vision, and they do not care about human rights. They do not care about the lives of others. They don't care about the international community. They don't care about anything. And where's the rest of the world? Where's the Muslim world to stand up for this? Because the process, like I said, it's not static. It's an ongoing process. Eventually, they will not allow Muslims to go into the Hebrew mosque, or they'll make the restrictions so severe that it'll be impossible. And that's what they do basically in Hebron, is they make life so difficult to live, that people leave because they don't have a choice. They go elsewhere. They have families, they have children, they need to live. So you've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of empty apartments, empty homes. You've got rows and rows and rows of shops, like ghost towns. The city's empty. Parts of the city are empty unless the settlers, because settlers are allowed to go anywhere they want. And what's so horrifying about this, that a lot of the restrictions were placed upon the Palestinians after 1994. In Ramadan of 1994, a Jewish settler, who was, by the way, a doctor, walked into the Ibrahimi Mosque while people were praying and began spraying with his machine gun as people were worshiping. After that unspeakable massacre, restrictions were placed on the Palestinians. Restrictions were placed on the Palestinians, the victims of the massacre, not on the people who perpetrated the crime. No, they have full rights. In fact, their conditions have improved. Their rights have been expanded. The restrictions were placed on the Palestinians, on the people who that city belongs to, the people who are the victims of this horrific act of this crime, unspeakable. There's one road in the old city of Hebron called Shuhada Street, and Shuhada Street was like the main thoroughfare, businesses and shops. That it was the life of the city. It's a ghost town. It's a ghost town, and the shops were shut and sealed, like with bars, and that's it, with metal bars. So you can't open the shops. You can't open the doors. And this was all as a result of a military order, because this is military law that governs Hebron as much as the West Bank, or the areas where Palestinians live. And in the order, it says that vehicles are not allowed to drive along Shuhada Street anymore. But I watch it and I see vehicles. Not only military vehicles, but the settler vehicles. So I read the order again, and in small print on the bottom, it says that, no vehicles are allowed to go through the street unless these are vehicles that are registered in Israel. Well, which vehicles are registered in Israel? The settlers' vehicles. So they drive no problem. Palestinians' cars are not allowed. And this was the result. This was the actions taken by the state of Israel after the Ibrahimi Mosque massacre. After the massacre. And this is the reality in which Palestinians have to live in this extremely important city. It's important religiously, it's important historically, it's important, in terms of commerce. It's a big, city. Very important city, the city of Hebron. And nobody knows what goes on, except for a very few dedicated people who are experts. Like I said, Maya is one of them. But it's nobody knows, and you very rarely hear anybody talk about the city of Hebron. Very rarely. Now, I don't know if you if you heard, but the Jordanian ambassador to Tel Aviv went into Al-Aqsa to pray. And on his way, as he was walking through the compound to the mosque, he was stopped by Israeli police. He was pushed around, and he was not permitted to go in. Now, this is not a coincidence. The fact that Israel has this new government with these extremist zealots, by the way, many of whom are part of these settlers in Hebron. Many of those people who are sitting now in the government and hold these important positions come from the settler community in Hebron. So we're talking about racist violence, thugs, the likes of which are it's unbelievable that they would be given such power. Now, as some of you may know, Jordan is the holy places in Jerusalem, and particularly Al-Aqsa, are governed by the Jordanian Waqf, right? Now, the Jordanian ambassador walking into Al-Aqsa would be almost like walking into his own embassy. So why is he being stopped suddenly? And that wasn't the first time that he visited. You know, he's a Muslim. He's allowed to go and pray there whenever he wants. Why would they now create this scene? And it was a scene. It was on social media. You could see it. You know, I published some my own thoughts about that as well in my podcast and so on. Why is this being done now? Why is it being done so violently? Why is it being done in a way that is so open? Because this new Israeli government wants to end this so-called, this reality in which that part of Jerusalem, the holy place in Jerusalem, are somehow part of another entity. These people, these settlers who are now sitting in the government, they see Al-Aqsa as their own. And they do not want to see a mosque there. They do not want to see Al-Aqsa there. They don't want to see Palestinians there. And the minister who is now in charge of the police, he's one of these settlers in Hebron that I just described. He is in charge of the police. He's in charge of what goes on there. And they have this movement called the rebuilding of the Jewish temple. And the process that is taking place in Jerusalem, it's not just on Al-Aqsa. It's all around, within the old city of Jerusalem and around the old city of Jerusalem. Neighborhood after neighborhood after neighborhood, you see massive expulsions of Palestinians and Jewish settlers coming in and taking over Palestinian homes. And the violence the terrorizing of Palestinians is such that people have to, in order to hold on to their homes, they need to sit in their home 24 hours a day, both within the old city and the neighborhood surrounding the old city. Because the vision that they have, that these Israelis have, is to have this greater Jerusalem. And anything around Jerusalem and within the old city of Jerusalem that has to do with Muslim heritage, with Palestinian heritage, even Christian heritage, has to be wiped out. So whether it's rights, whether it's destruction of monuments, or whether it's allowing monuments to just fall into disrepair, whether it's destruction of mosques, of cemeteries. This is being done on a regular basis all around Jerusalem all the time. There was an ancient cemetery just outside of the old city in a neighborhood called Mamila. It's an old neighborhood that was, Palestinians were kicked out a long time ago. And there was a cemetery that went back to Salah ad-Din. And for several years, that entire area was blocked off, and they were digging and clearing out, and digging and clearing out, and digging and clearing out. Interestingly enough, to build what is called a museum of tolerance, which is kind of an extension of the Holocaust Museum, on that hallowed ground. That's the absurdity of this reality. But for them, it's not absurd. They have an agenda. They pursue it very, very, very straightforward, unapologetic way, and nobody's stopping them. They get billions of dollars from America. They get billions of dollars from other European countries. They get weapons from America and European countries. They do business everywhere they want, including the Arab and the Muslim world. So why would they stop? Why would they stop? There's no reason for them to stop. They're zealots. They have an agenda, and the rest of the world welcomes it. So it's interesting because now the American Secretary of State was just in, he was visiting Tel Aviv and he visited Ramallah and so on. And there was this expectation that maybe the Americans are going to somehow broker a peace deal. People are still asking the question, maybe the Americans will do something this time. The Americans are giving billions of dollars and selling weapons. And they provide a diplomatic cover for Israel in the UN and everywhere else. Now, these settlers, the settler group that I described that exists in Hebron and other places in Palestine, of course, they operate. They had a branch in the United States called the JDL. It was called the Jewish Defense League. And they were designated by the State Department as a terrorist organization, as a Jewish terrorist organization. Even the State Department recognized them as a designated terrorist organization. A year ago, they were taken off the list. And they're saying, well, they're not active, they're not really doing anything, they don't really exist. But beyond that, the understanding is that there's no such thing as Jewish terrorism. Palestinian terrorism, yes. Muslim terrorism, yes. But there's no such thing as Jewish terrorism. Now, if you look at Palestine for the last 75 years, all you see is Jewish terrorism. Not just by this particular group, who have connections to the settler group that I described, but all of the state of Israel throughout its existence has been one act of terrorism against the Palestinian people. Destruction of sites, destruction of mosques and churches and villages and towns and expulsions and home demolitions. It has been one long, endless act of terrorism. Now, particularly this group, the fact that they were taken off the list allowed them to raise money. And then there are people in the Israeli parliament, one very big, that's why they're in the government. So America enabled this, is paying for this, is weaponizing this. Why would anybody think that America is interested in ending this? The Americans are doing everything they can to keep it going, as does the Europeans in many ways. Why is there any expectation that somehow the visit of an American Secretary of State would end this? So not only did this visit not end it, it actually made it worse, if you can imagine. So the Secretary of State announced that America will give $50 million a year more to the UN agency that deals with the Palestinian refugees, UNRWA. $50 million is like a drop in this endless bucket of the needs of Palestinian refugees, because Palestinian refugees live in unbelievably horrifying conditions. Not only in Palestine, but outside of Palestine too. So it's really an insult. It's an insult to give that amount of money to such an enormous problem. Besides, Palestinian refugees don't want money and charity and relief. They want the ability to go back home. They want to go back to their homes and villages and towns. They don't want relief. They don't want charity. They need it, unfortunately, but that's not what they want. Then he negotiated, and Palestinians will be allowed to have a 4G network in Ramallah in those areas, because Israel only allowed them 3G until now, so 4G network. Okay, another massive, of course, step towards peace, right? And then in another item that was not really publicized very much, the United States wants to arm and train a Palestinian fighting force, like a little commando, that will fight against the Palestinian fighters in Nablus and Jenin, in the northern part of the West Bank, because they've been fighting for a very long time. There's a whole history of resistance in that part of Palestine. So they want to create more killing and strife among Palestinians to the point where it could be civil war. Can you imagine somebody whose son is going to be part of this absurd fighting force sent to kill Palestinians who most Palestinians admire because they're the freedom fighters? Who would want to be part of that? What kind of criminals, corrupt criminals, would want to be part of that? So not only did Blinken's visit not help, planning to make things worse for the Palestinians, and basically absolve Israel from the need to deal with Palestinian fighters in that part of Palestine. So we look to Americans to somehow broker a peace deal? Of course not. Of course not. It's an absurd idea. So again, I'm listing all of these obstacles and all of these problems, and we need to be aware of all of this. To talk about Palestine without being aware of the reality in which Palestinians exist, it's not going to help. It's not helpful. There's no way we can intelligently discuss Palestine, the future of Palestine, the past of Palestine, where Palestine is today, without realizing what is taking place in Palestine. There is no status quo. People like to use this term status quo, status quo. There's never been a status quo. Israel is marching forward with destruction and killing. And the strengthening of the apartheid state all the time, everywhere. I'll give you another example. So the Naqab is almost the entire southern part of Palestine. And that's originally where Palestinian Bedouin exists. And there are some 300,000 Palestinian Bedouin in that part of the country. Many of the refugees in Gaza are from that area, from the Naqab. So there's a strong connection there. So just in that part of the country, over the last 4 years, there have been over 10,000 home demolitions. Just in that part of the country. Now, Bedouin Palestinians are among the poorest of the poor in Palestine. It's the poorest of the poor community, while at the same time, the Israeli towns and settlements in the Naqab enjoy some of the highest standards of living. So you've got a very wealthy city across the street from the poorest of the poor. Now, of those 10,000 homes demolished over the last 4 years or so, how many homes do you think were Israeli Jewish homes? I mean, Israeli Jews live there too, right? How many of those would you guess were Israeli Jewish homes that were demolished? Anybody care to guess? Zero. Not one. Could it be that only Palestinians build without a permit? Could it be that Palestinians are all criminals and Israelis never commit a crime? Could it be that Israelis never build without a permit? Is it possible? I know Israelis who built without a permit. Now, we're not talking necessarily about building a home. We're talking maybe about sometimes just adding a little room or adding a balcony. That's cause for demolition of the entire home. I know Israelis who do it all the time. So what happens when an Israeli builds illegally without a permit? If the authorities find out, they'll send an inspector, and the inspector will write a report, and there might be a fine. So they go to court, and they say, I don't want to pay the fine. I did nothing wrong. And then the lawyers fight over this, and it goes years and years and years. And maybe a few years later, there'll be another fine. You never see a home demolished in an Israeli Jewish town. You never see a home demolished. Only Palestinian homes are demolished. Thousands per year. And that's only the Naqab. I'm not talking about other parts of Palestine. God knows how many home demolition orders and homes are being demolished. And now with this new government, particularly in Jerusalem had, I think until recently, something almost like 18 or 19,000 home demolition orders. So there's an order, and then the government will destroy whenever they want to. So you're living in a home, and you don't know if tomorrow morning at 3:00 in the morning, Israeli forces will come with bulldozers and destroy your home. You don't know. It might be tomorrow morning. It might be another year. It might be never. But you're living under this cloud. Now, this new government, they are demolishing around Jerusalem with huge numbers. They are taking all these home demolition orders and acting on them, enacting all of them. Are any of them homes of Israeli Jews, of Israeli settlers? Of course not. There's no law that says you can't do it, and there's no law that says you have to destroy Palestinian homes. But this is how it's done. This is policy. And now the policy is being determined by people who are worse, more violent, more racist, more Arab-hating, more Palestinian-hating than ever before. And that's saying a lot. Now, where do we go from here? So, I mean, obviously, everybody wants peace. Everybody wants to see Palestinians living in peace. Everyone wants to see the end. Well, not everybody, but many people want to see the end of the violence, right? If everybody wanted it, it would happen. So Palestinians came up with the demand for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS. Okay. So you would think, naturally, that the first countries that would adopt this would be the Arab and the Muslim countries. That's not the case. In fact, the opposite is the case. More and more Arab countries are starting developing diplomatic relations with Israel. And those that aren't have been doing business with Israel for a very long time. Saudi Arabia is the one that Israel wants the most. And other Muslim countries around the globe as well. They're doing with Israel even if they don't have a relationship with Israel. I had an interesting experience. I was giving a talk in London, and I was talking about BDS, and I was talking about this and the other, and somebody came to me to ask a question, and he said that he is from Malaysia, and people have told him in Malaysia that if to support boycott of Israel in Malaysia means Malaysians will lose jobs. I said, what? What is he talking about? Is it possible that Israeli companies are doing business in Malaysia and providing jobs for Malaysians? I don't know the answer to that yet. I've never heard any, I don't have any data or that. But the fact that he came up and he said, I'm from Malaysia, and we are told that if we boycott Israel in Malaysia, we will lose jobs. And he said, what do I say to people? I mean, what do I say to people when that comes up? I was in shock. I mean, the fact that is the reality even in Malaysia. But it just shows you that Israel knows how to do business everywhere. And to get even countries who are friendly and have favorable relations with Palestine and, favorable policies regarding Palestine, even in those countries, the reality exists in which there is a dependency on Israel somehow. Whether it's the government in some countries, whether it's agriculture in other countries, whether it's buying weapons in other countries, whether it's jobs. And most of this stuff is done under the radar, under the table, so people don't really know about it. But there it is. So this is a big problem. Now, I live in Washington, D.C. And, there's big embassies in Washington, D.C. And they all have their flags. There's nothing, not a single office, not a single agency, not a single Palestinian flag in all of Washington, D.C. Nothing. There used to be an office of the PLO, and it was closed down by the Trump administration. And there's no intention to allow them to come back. And they couldn't do much anyway. They weren't even a diplomatic mission. They were just the office of the PLO. They called the head person there an ambassador, but he wasn't an ambassador. He had no diplomatic status whatsoever. So in the biggest capital, and perhaps even the most important capital in the world, the most influential one, there is nobody talking about Palestine. There is nobody pursuing the Palestinian agenda, the Palestinian interests. Nothing. If you don't exist in Washington, D.C., you don't exist. And Palestinians don't exist. And that is a serious, serious problem. I was talking to a young man who works as an intern in the office of one of the senators. And he told me they get 300 emails every day from just one pro-Israeli group. 300 emails per day. And what they do is they get the constituents of the senator to send these emails. So the senator's staff have to reply. They have to deal with it because it's constituents. It's not just a blank email from some organization. That's how well organized they are. And on the Palestinian side, there's nothing. Zero. Nothing is being done. And very few people realize that there is no Palestinian representation in Washington, D.C. Again, like you were saying earlier, even countries who are friendly to Palestine don't realize that this is the reality. So how do we get from where we are today to peace in Palestine? Like I said in the beginning, there's no question in my mind that it's possible. There's no question in my mind that it's inevitable. It's inevitable. Over 2 million people living in a huge concentration camp, just 30 minutes drive from the city of Tel Aviv, which is this big, fun, bustling city on the beach. And, you can see when the Israeli planes bomb Gaza, you can see the smoke from Tel Aviv. It's that close. And from the beaches, people on the beach, you can see the smoke. Sometimes you can even hear the bombing. And nobody stops going to the beach. Nobody stops having fun. Nobody cares. So we have to make them care. And how do you make people care? Well, we have to make them care is one thing. And the other thing, we have to make people outside of Palestine act. Two things have to happen at the same time. And I have a very good friend who's an activist in Hebron. He's the activist in Hebron. His name is Asa Amro. And he was just in the US. And he always says, we have to make it costly. We have to make the occupation costly. Until it's so costly that Israelis, like apartheid South Africa, have nowhere to go. The apartheid state of South Africa, when it existed, it's been a long time. They couldn't participate in the Olympics. They couldn't participate in sporting events. They couldn't participate in any commerce with international. They couldn't visit other countries with their passport. They're prohibited from visiting, and you were prohibited. And you could get punished for conducting trade or inviting a South African delegation or anything like that. You would be penalized. That's where we need to go. That's making it costly. That's making it costly. When Palestinians protest, when Palestinians engage in any kind of resistance, whether it's armed resistance or unarmed resistance, which my friend Asa is engaged in Hebron, that makes it costly, but it's not enough. Israel created a reality where regardless how hard Palestinians work, it's never going to be enough. It's like asking people in a prison to set themselves free. They can't. There's guards, there's walls, there's guns. They can't set themselves free. They can think about it. They can do a little bit, but they can't do it. We, people on the outside, people of conscience, have to do it. We have to demand from our governments to do more. We have to demand from our friends to do more. We have to demand that people not only engage, but educate themselves. The apartheid report that was put out by Amnesty International, this was last February. I always ask people, has anybody read it? And very few people took the trouble even to read it. It's, 200 pages or something. It's really important to read and then to send it to your friends, to send it to everybody else, to say, hey. So maybe in Malaysia, this conversation is obvious, but it's important for people to be aware. Because people in Malaysia go overseas, they go to other countries, the other people from other countries come here. This conversation has to take place every day, and people have to be aware. And they're not going to be aware. We have to read, we have to be educated. This book that I mentioned, the 4,000-year history, people don't know that history. People don't know, even people who are educated don't know that history. I did an interview in my podcast. It's called the Miko Peled podcast, if anybody wants to check it out, with a very well-known, the editor of a very well-known publication called Mondoweiss. You've heard of Mondoweiss. Okay, so Phil Weiss is one of the founders. And so I met with him, and we discussed these issues. And he says it's incredible to him, he's Jewish, he comes from a Jewish community, that, the Jewish community in America, by religion, is the wealthiest. And it's one of the most highly educated, among the highest educated in America. And they refute the findings, generally, as a community, they refute the findings of Amnesty International. They absolutely reject the definition of Israel as an apartheid regime, or that the fact that Israel is engaged in the crime of apartheid. They reject it. What's there to reject? It's like rejecting, that the earth is round. You can reject it as much as you want. It's still there. Now, are you just going to let it? And he was very frustrated about the fact that his community, the community from which he comes, is willing to disregard the horrible oppression that is taking place in Palestine and to support the state that does it, which is Israel. So it's really important to create that awareness in every country. Like I said, even the countries that are most friendly to Palestine people don't necessarily understand. And even the politicians, They have a lot of priorities. Palestine is one of them, but it's never the first, never the top one. We have to make it the top one. And we have to think every single day creatively, how do we bring about how do we overcome and change this reality that has so many different layers and so many obstacles between where we are today and the establishment of a free, democratic Palestine on all of Palestine, which is, I believe, the vision that we should all be, supporting. How do we get from here to there? It's something that each and every one of us needs to think about, talk about with their friends, read a book and give it to a friend or have a book club to discuss it. This has to happen. This has to happen everywhere, because Palestine will not be freed on its own. There's not going to be Salah ad-Din coming to liberate Palestine. It's not going to happen. Each and every one of us in the room has to be Salah ad-Din. And each and every one of us has to do it. The reality in the Gaza Strip, the reality in the ghettos in the West Bank, the reality of Palestinian Bedouins in the Naqab, the horrendous reality in Jerusalem. To be a Palestinian in Jerusalem today is a curse. It's a curse. There's so many authorities, one on top of the other, that is making life unlivable. I was born and raised in Jerusalem. I've been gone for many years, but if I come back tomorrow, I can come back and live there. And if I had property, I can have my property and there'll be no problem. Palestinians whose families go back 800 years. I have Palestinian friends who have had families in the old city 800 years. Recorded. Not by some, legend, recorded. And left the country for a little bit. Their ID is taken away. Their status is taken away. They can't come back. 800 years. I was born in Jerusalem. My parents were born in Jerusalem. But before that, my family was, in Russia and Ukraine. I can go back. We have all the rights. Palestinians in Jerusalem who go back 1,000 years sometimes, 800 years, 500 years, that the part of the old city was named after their family. Well, that is how deep they're rooted in Jerusalem. If they leave, and the rules change all the time. Sometimes it's 3 years, sometimes it's 2 years, sometimes it's 5 years, it doesn't matter. They take away their status. They can't come back. They can come back as tourists. And their property is taken, confiscated, their house is gone. This is how severe it is. So if we want to move from here to what I believe is the ideal reality, which is a free, democratic Palestine, one person, one vote, through all of historic Palestine, not 5% here and 2% there, all of Palestine. One person, one vote, equal rights, a free, democratic Palestine. If that's where we want to go, if we believe in this vision, then we have to do something every single day. We have to act. We have to be educated. We have to talk to other people. We have to demand our governments do more. We have to demand that our business community does more. We have to demand that our diplomats around the world do more, because Palestinians can't do it. They don't even have they don't have agency. They don't even have somebody representing them in the capitals around the world. And many of the ones that do, it's just a PLO office. They don't have diplomatic missions. They're not invited to all the diplomatic functions because they're not diplomatic. They're not diplomats. They don't have diplomatic status. So we have to be their diplomats. Our diplomats, Malaysian diplomats, have to be their diplomats. That's how important it is if we want to really see this. If we want to see Palestine free and Palestinians free and the refugees allowed to return to their home. Mustafa's family is not from Gaza. Acre, right? That's the town that they're from. Now there's an Israeli town there. But they should have the right to go back. So if we want to see that happen, we have to do something about it. And I think that all people of conscience around the world need to act and need to do something. And I want to end with an optimistic note. I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that it's possible. In fact, I think it's inevitable that Palestine will be free. And Palestinians will be free. And Palestinians will be allowed to return. The refugees will be allowed to return. But they can't do it on their own. We have to be there. And if we act, I believe that we will see it, that there's a good possibility that we'll see it soon. Thank you very much.
I'll get allowed to ask questions.
Yes, you are. Absolutely. Absolutely.
I've been following you on Instagram.
Thank you.
I'm a huge fan.
Okay, thank you.
Actually, I have always wanted to say something along the way, but since no one said anything, so I didn't say anything as well. So I just wonder, like, how is the situation among Israelis? Like, what are the chances of them, like, supporting Palestinians? Like, what are the chances of them, like, how much of the Israeli population could possibly support Palestinian cause? Like, from your point of view as Israeli American.
Well, that's a very important question. Now, if you've noticed, over the last several weeks, since the new Israeli government has been in place, thousands and thousands, tens of thousands, 90,000, 100,000, very big numbers of Israelis are in the street protesting against the government. And people always wonder, well, are they protesting for Palestine? Are they protesting? What exactly is going on there? Because you don't see Palestinians there. Now, where do they protest? They protest in Tel Aviv. Most Palestinians can't go to Tel Aviv. So obviously that tells you something. They're protesting because they're worried that this particular government might erode some of the rights, some of the privileges that Israelis have within the apartheid regime. They're not protesting to end the apartheid regime. They're not protesting to end the siege on Gaza. They're not protesting for Palestinian rights. No, they're protesting because they don't like the face of this government. The face of this government is really the true face of Israel, but it's ugly. They like the other faces who are more, amenable. They like to talk about peace. They like to talk about reconciliation. This government doesn't care, and they don't say anything about peace. They want to kill and they want to take over, and they want to get rid of Palestinians. That's it. And they're very straightforward about it. Now, these Israelis, and I've said this many, many times, if Israelis wanted to see the siege on Gaza, which is cruel and unjustifiable, inexcusable, they could do it. These 100,000 people that were in Tel Aviv could protest near Gaza and demand that the government end this horrifying siege. No, they never did. They never did. Now they're protesting because they're worried that their privilege just might be eroded by laws that this government is passing about the judiciary and things like that. And also because they thought that these faces are only going to be in the West Bank. Suddenly they're right there. They are representing them. They are in the government. And Israelis are not happy with that. That's why they're protesting. So Israeli society doesn't care and doesn't think that the Palestinian issue is their problem.
I might be living in my bubble because I've been following pages like Jewish Voice for Peace, and I follow your page because I believe not all Jews are evil or bad.
No, not all of them.
I used to live in the United States, and some of my close friends are Jews. So I kind of believe that we need to spread awareness that Judaism shouldn't be conflated with Zionism.
That's right.
Yeah. And I've been wondering, like, Jews in Israel really supporting Palestinians? Because I've been living in that bubble, you know what I mean? Like,
they don't support
Palestine. That I follow kind of support Palestine.
Yeah.
So
it's a very, very, very small minority of Israelis that support, freedom for Palestine.
Whenever I want to position, we are criticizing the Israeli government. I feel like, are we really criticizing the government, or is it like the whole settler community in Israel? Like, I kind of like.
Well, all Israelis are settlers. They're, Israelis who live in Tel Aviv or other places like to pretend that only the settlers in the West Bank are settlers. We're not settlers. We're nice people. How did we end up in these places? Tel Aviv sits on Jaffa, and a whole bunch of other Palestinian towns and villages were destroyed. Tel Aviv University sits on 4 different Palestinian villages that were destroyed. When you walk in Tel Aviv, you walk on the destruction of Jaffa. So all Israelis are settlers. All of Israelis are settlers. And if they don't admit it, that's too bad. But there is very, very little, very, very small amount of Israelis that would stand up and talk about Palestinian rights. They exist, but it's a very small handful. And so I wouldn't, no, obviously not all Jews agree on anything. Not all people of any faith agree on everything. But as a society, if you want to see the face of Israeli society and what they think, look at the results of the elections. The vast majority of Israelis vote, very high numbers vote, and look at the makeup of the government. Look at the makeup of the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. That represents Israelis. And on the issue of Palestine, there's almost complete agreement.
So I guess it makes sense when you say, like, make the occupation costly, because only in that way, the population will realize that
Yes.
they have to support it.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for very enlightening.
Miko, can you repeat the question later on? Because for the
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you very much for very enlightening talk. Mr.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us here today. May I ask two questions?
Yes.
First question: Israel was formed with a declared intent to be the homeland of the world's Jews. 75 years later, the majority of the world's Jewish community are outside Israel for whatever reasons.
Yeah.
On that score alone, would you consider Israel to be a failed state? My second is a very fundamental question because it's a fact that those numbers is a fact that the Western corporate media, mainstream media, does not want to dwell.
Mm-hmm.
My second question is, the way Israeli policies towards Palestinians, towards Peled, so on and so forth, are perpetuated through the protection and patronage of the world remaining superpower. But superpowers rise and superpowers fall in world history. Is there not a concern in Israel that this protection and patronage might not last 20, 30 years down the road?
Yeah.
They're so dependent on support, blind support from the US. So they're drunk on this drug called impunity.
Yeah.
And sooner or later, the drug peddler might not be able to supply the drug.
Mm-hmm.
So what's going to happen then? Is there not a concern among Israelis that that scenario would arise?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, to repeat the questions, one question was, is Israel a failed state since most Jewish people do not live there? And is there any concern among Israelis that the peddler, the United States, which gives Israel its impunity, will one time either fall or change his mind? Those are two very, very important questions. It's not that I agree. What you said is absolutely true. Most Jews don't live there and don't want to live there. Not only that, but even after the Holocaust, the survivors of the Holocaust, the vast majority of the survivors of the Holocaust. I'll ask you a question again. How many do you think, what percentage do you think went to what became Israel? What percentage of the survivors of the Holocaust actually went to Palestine and what became Israel? What percentage would you guess? Anybody want to guess? All of them? What?
5%? No, because it's never publicized.
Yeah, no, less than 10, between 5 and 10%. A very, very small fraction of the survivors of the Holocaust, the genocide of the Jews in Europe. Very small percentage, less than 10% went to Israel. And Israel was begging them to come. They were there all over Europe. They had agencies. And many of those that went left because they just experienced racism and violence. And why go and live in a place that is practicing racism and violence? They're not stupid. So a very small percentage actually, so most Israelis have nothing to do with their experience, has nothing to do with the Holocaust. But the reality is that not only did most Jews not live there, even the Jews who suffered the most and survived didn't go there. Didn't want to go there. They either went back home in Europe, wherever they were from, or they came to America or other places. And this is a very important point. But I think it's not just that Israel is a failed state. I think that the claim that Zionism is actually, the purpose of Zionism is to create a homeland for the Jews is false. Because Jewish people are a religion. They're not nationality. They never were. Even if you read some of the greatest rabbis throughout history always wrote, Jews are a nation by virtue of their faith, of the Jewish law, that they observe Jewish law. So that's why you can have Jews in Yemen, you could have Jews in Ukraine, you could have Jews everywhere. They don't speak the same language, they don't have the same culture, they don't eat the same food, they don't look the same. They share the same religion. They follow the same Sharia, the same religious law. And this has been the views of Jews always. Then the Zionists came and said, no. Jews are not a religion. Jews are a nationality. It's not a religious issue. And the rabbis at the time said, what is this nonsense? In fact, the rabbis at the time, in 1900, Zionism was established in the late 19th century. In 1900, the most important rabbis of the time came out with a book. And this book contained warning to Jewish people of the disasters that will come as a result of Zionism. The disasters will come to Jews as a result of Zionism. And they said three things. Now, mind you, this is 1900. Zionism was barely crawling, you know? It was a new thing. But they sensed that this was very dangerous to Jewish people. And they basically, to summarize it, I read it. They said three things, three warnings. Number one, Zionism will bring violence to the Holy Land. Number two, Zionism will ruin the good relations. Listen to this. Will ruin the good relations between Jews and Muslims and Jews and Arabs that existed throughout history. Jewish communities in Iraq, in Iran, in Yemen, in Palestine, in Syria, everywhere, had good relations with the Arab and Muslim brothers and sisters. This, they said, will ruin that relationship. And the third thing they said is, it will cast doubt as to the loyalty of Jewish people. Because Jewish people live everywhere. Jewish Americans, Jewish Polish Jews, whatever, everywhere, right? Suddenly people will doubt their loyalty. So wait, are you a member, are you a citizen, a loyal citizen of the United States? Or is your loyalty to America, to Israel? Which one is it? And this is being raised today, actually, quite a lot. And they're saying, oh, that's anti-Semitism to say that. But it's not anti-Semitism. It's a fair question. Where is your loyalty? To Israel? Because Judaism has nothing to do with Israel. In fact, I'm kind of going on a tangent here, but I'm writing a book about this right now. Jewish law, strict Jewish law, prohibits Jewish people from sovereignty in the Holy Land. I'll say it again, because when I say it, usually people think I fell on my head. According to Jewish law, Jewish people are prohibited from sovereignty in the Holy Land. They can go pray, they can worship there, if they want to live there, one or two, not as all of them together. Zionism said, no. If you say that, then you're not really Jewish. If you say that, then you're nobody. And the Zionists came out, and if you read what some of the Zionists, the early Zionists, the fathers of Zionism said about the Jews, about the Orthodox religious Jews, you would not believe what they said. If anybody said that today, they would be destroyed. It was so anti-Semitic. It was horrifying things about how the Jews are ugly and the Zionists are good looking. And the Jews are, filthy, and all they want is money. And Zionists are hardworking, strong, good-looking people. You wouldn't believe the stuff that the Zionists wrote about the Jews, because those Jews, the Jewish community, which at the time was mostly very religious, stood up against Zionism, against this idea. And even today, what's interesting, these settlers, this group of these particular settlers, they all claim that they're religious Jews. But they reject what all these Jewish rabbis throughout entire history have said. They said, no, that's nonsense. Today it's different. We don't have to listen to that. So we can, have sovereignty in the Holy Land. And one of the biggest prohibitions is to walk onto what the Jews call the Temple Mount, Al-Aqsa compound, which is where supposedly the Jewish temple used to be. Prohibited by law from stepping on there. Now, the settlers, who also dress like religious Jews, not only do they go there, they have tours there. Tens of thousands go every year on what they call tours. It's really a provocation. I went with them a couple of times just to see what they do. It's madness. And as I was there just this summer, and I was standing in line with them, because there's so many that wanted to go, you stand in line in the sun, and the other Jews, the real Orthodox Jews, are giving out flyers saying, this is prohibited. The rabbis for centuries have said Jews are prohibited from stepping on that hallowed ground. And they say, no, we have our other rabbis. We have other rabbis, and they said it's okay. So the connection between Jews and Palestine is something that was created by the Zionists. So they said Jews are not a religion, they're a nation. The Bible is not a religious book. It's our history book, the Old Testament. It's our history book. And our homeland is Palestine. And that's it. They created this reality and then they pursued it. And then in Europe, Christian Zionists supported it and helped them along, of course. And that's how it was created. So the argument that somehow they wanted to create a homeland for the Jews contradicts Jewish law. You know, they're completely secular. Now, just a second, he had another question, whether the fear of you know, the dealer, if you will, the fear that somehow American, they don't think about that. That's never part of the conversation. It's never part of the conversation. Israelis believe that they control America and that's it, which is in many ways true. The pro-Israeli groups within the United States do a fantastic job, not just in politics, in education, in culture, in so many different things. They have great influence and they've worked on it for a very long time. So they make sure, for example, that in the public schools, the curriculum where it talks about that part of the world is the one that they agree with. They have actual organizations that go to they have special conferences for teachers who teach what it's called social sciences. And they make sure that the curriculum that was written as the textbooks, it follows the Zionist narrative. It's very well organized. It's not just in Washington, D.C. It's just not to politicians. And so this is, Israel has to be very confident about this. And to be quite honest, I think what's typical to racist societies, what's typical if we look throughout history, violent racist societies, if we look throughout the 20th century, they're very short-sighted, which is why they always collapse and fall. They collapse and fall because it's unsustainable. They're not sustainable. And we've seen that over and over again. And I think that is why this is going to fall as well. Zionism, the state of Israel, is not sustainable. It can stand a very long time, but inevitably, I believe it's going to collapse. And there are many signs already that it's collapsing, but basically, I think that's what's going to happen. So there is no conversation about that at all. No, not at all.
Can I just pursue that a little bit more? Notwithstanding what they think, okay? But I think that many people recognize declining unipolar hegemony in the United States, okay? And the slow emergence of multipolarity, okay? And in particular, I'm thinking about what this might mean, okay, for the axis of resistance, okay? Syria, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, and their sympathizers, okay? Do you see the axis of resistance to the extent that it begins to draw strength, okay, from this changing balance of power globally, okay? Do you see the axis of resistance, okay, having much bearing, okay, on what's happening within Israel?
Well, that's a good question, but let's say that, you know, one is the leader of an Arab nation, an Arab country. What do I see when I look at the Arab world today? I have two choices. I can end up like Iraq, like Libya, like Yemen, like Syria, or I can end up like the Emiratis in the Gulf and Egypt and, you know, so forth. It's the countries that kind of work and collaborate with Israel and the United States. These are the two choices. What would anybody choose if they were leader of a country? To end up like Libya? To end up like Yemen? To end up like Iraq? God forbid. These are the choices. So I don't think it's going to be successful, effective, unless there's a larger movement to support the cause of justice and freedom in Palestine. Because on its own, the Israeli propaganda, I suppose, but it's more than propaganda. The Israeli machine is so far ahead of us, you know, at least 100 years ahead of us. When I say us, I mean people who care about, you know, justice for Palestine, because nothing is happening on this. A lot of talk is happening. You know, there's some support for Hamas, there's some support, but it's you know, it's no challenge to Israel, you know, because Israel has the firepower. You know, what Israelis have learned, the Israeli military learned, for example, is they should never, ever have soldiers in Gaza. Because it's dangerous, because fighter to fighter, the fighter in Gaza is much stronger and more dedicated, even though they have less resources, than the Israeli soldier. So they're not, in the last few attacks on Gaza, they did not have ground forces, because in 2014, the ground forces were punished severely with many casualties of even higher ranking officers. So they're not doing that anymore, but they've got the planes, they've got the firepower, and there are no air defenses in Gaza. And I don't think they're ever going to have any, so, and the same thing with Lebanon, same thing with Hezbollah. I mean, soldier to soldier, we saw in 2006, I mean, the Israeli soldiers ran back, and these were the best of the Israeli soldiers. But then Israel came in and created 1 million refugees in southern Lebanon. So militarily, it's a lost cause. But I think if we expand this circle of people who care and want to see, like I said, freedom and justice in Palestine, and even now, like I said, we're really on the edge of a precipice like never before. I think even the suffering of people in Gaza, who are strong and proud and incredible, incredible people, all the suffering they've gone through is nothing compared to what's coming up, because this new government needs to show that they're stronger, that they're tougher, so that they're going to punish Palestinians more. And of course, Gaza is the easiest target. But I don't think that this axis is enough. It's not enough. There has to be a much bigger.
Military aspect again, but
yeah, but even diplomatically, look at what's happening around the world diplomatically. From time to time, somebody recognizes Palestine, but what does that mean? It means nothing. There has to be a much more, a much stronger campaign, international campaign to make any kind of real difference. And like I said, sadly, we're 100 years away, 100 years behind. So we have to act very quickly if we're going to do something. Yes, do we have time, or are we done? I think there's one question, but it's a... Yeah, okay, last question, please. Please.
I just want to show what being taught in Israel college university. I thought this is also part of doing that narrative history. But even the history, I believe it's what BB shared in his latest book, basically Land of People, Land.
Yeah.
They just take back what they have left in Harlem, something like that. I believe so. That's what he taught in school. But even then, the question is there any moral conscience, like the one that you teach in school, even your sister? You just have to go to West Bank or whatnot and see what's happening there. Is that right for you to come someone, or for you to live there? The conscious, I think that's what drives you, whatever you're doing now.
Yeah, of course. Well, it's hard to judge except to see what Israelis do. We don't know what they feel. We can't judge what they think, but we see what they do and we see who they vote for. And
or the alternative is like, if you admit to the truth, basically you admit to your destruction.
Well, that's what they think. They think that the identity as an Israeli is connected to the Zionist narrative, which is, for example, that 1948 was a heroic war of independence. When I went through the process personally of realizing that is a lie, and that 1948 was a huge crime against humanity perpetrated by the Zionists, by the Israelis, this is not an easy thing to come to terms with. But I had the support of Palestinians who became my friends. This is back in the United States, even not in Palestine. And I had the support of Palestinians who allowed me to go through this process kind of like a baby learning to walk. Very slowly, unsure, doubting, but little by little gaining confidence. And so I was very fortunate in that regard. Israelis don't have to go to the West Bank. They can go to a dozen Palestinian towns that are considered within Israel, that are, where Palestinian citizens of Israel reside, in Nazareth, in Haifa, in all these other cities, in Lid, in Yaf, cities where there's a big Palestinian community, in the Naqab, some of the cities. They don't even have to go to the West Bank. But now there's a sense, actually not just now, when I was growing up, it was the same. It's dangerous to go into a Palestinian town. It's dangerous to go into a Palestinian village because you don't know what they might do. Inherently they hate us and they want to kill us. And so we have to be careful. So it's interesting. And if you walk around the old city of Jerusalem, the settler children, when they walk, they have a bodyguard in front and a bodyguard in the behind them, anywhere they go in the old city. The settlers, and these bodyguards are armed. If an Israeli tour, if they want to see the old city, they're always an armed escort. Always. Palestinian kids who grow up there are really the victims. The settlers are not victims. Nobody's hurting them. The Palestinians are the ones who are being killed. They run around the old city, kicking their ball, playing around. They mess around. They curse the soldiers. They you know what I mean? They're free. And you think, wait a minute, who is here occupied? The person that needs an armed guard for their kids to walk, 100 meters? Or these Palestinian kids who are like, looking, of course it's ours. They don't need somebody to tell them and guard them and protect them, even though they do. The reality is that they do, but they don't have a fear. And this is, I think, demonstrates what Israeli society looks like, what Israeli society thinks, how Israeli society feels in regards to Palestinians. Even something that simple, it demonstrates, the difference between these two societies. And there's no place where they meet. There's no place where they can see each other and meet. There isn't, because Israel prevents it. And I could tell you stories like this, all day and all night. But this is the reality, and I think, like we said earlier, it has to be so costly that literally Israeli society and the Israeli state need to be on their knees, like apartheid South Africa was, and then change will come. That's my belief. Thank you very much.
Okay. You can stay there.
Oh, okay.
I just want to say thank you very much to Miko Peled. That was very informative and I think inspiring. And also it reminds us that we all have a duty to do something. And in line with what you said, Yusuf and Al Jamal and I had explored transnational solidarity with Palestine. And this is why we came up with our third book on the common struggles between the Irish, struggle against colonizers and Palestine. So I hope you'll enjoy this book.
Oh, thank you very, very
Yes.
much. Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you. Yes, I know you and Yusuf do fantastic work together. Yeah, he's a wonderful man.
Thank you very much.
He's a great friend. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks.
Yeah.
So that's it.